What happiness is mine, oh my God, to be able to pray with my brothers and sisters, knowing on your own word that we have the advantage of your presence in the midst of us. You are with us, O good Jesus, to imbue us with your Holy Spirit, as you yourself have told us by the voice of your prophet. Grant us to receive this Holy Spirit as the apostles and disciples did in the cenacle, when they were assembled for prayer and persevered with mind and heart therein. St. John Baptist de Lasallian, with Jesus in our hearts.
What's the source of that prayer? What's that book?
The fundamental prayer. Ever hear of it? That's your due for the morning. All right, we left off yesterday, and I was making the point that the foundation of the Institute was a process. And the first stage of the process was the formation of a community, which de La Salle saw little by little was so tremendously important for what he gradually became aware of was going to be his mission. And the problem here is straightening out the dates of the sequence, but I think they're fairly clear now, with most everybody agreeing that the first joined with Niel in opening 2 schools. Then he brought them into his own home for meals. Then he had a house rented next door for them. Then he brought them into his own home to live. Then he finally put the house up for sale and moved in with them to the house on the Rue Neuve. Now, it's in the house at the Rue Neuve, apparently, that that de La Salle's conversion takes place. And maybe one element in that was the loss of the very first brothers, because as this process was going on, some of them began to see, well, this is not what we bargained for at all. He's turning us into some sort of cloistered monks or something, or he's working us too hard at the school, or we don't mind teaching, or we don't mind praying, but it might be very difficult to expect us to do both. So if you go to page 72 of Blanc, it'd be interesting to know whether that famous 14-year-old kid was one of those who stayed or one of those who left. Chances are he probably decided to go back to Rouen. But so Blanc has these pious reflections on page 72. Notice at the top of that page that Blanc's remark that although he let them discuss how they were going to live and how these regulations were going to put together, he says he contented himself with inspiring them with his own spirit and thus gave them the flattering satisfaction of thinking that they themselves had originated their new manner of life and their practices. So anyway, some of them give up and go. And down in the next to the last paragraph, he was obliged to replace nearly all his personnel in the space of 6 months. Only 1 or 2 of the original schoolmasters remained with him. The new institute's tomb seemed destined to be erected close by its cradle. Now, one of the problems is when did this happen? Did it happen while they were still in the founder's own home, which is the view that I think most of us are inclined to now, rather than at the Rue Neuve? Or did it happen when they moved into the Rue Neuve and had all of that, the security of living in the founder's mansion taken away from them? I suppose you could argue either one. But there's nothing very clear here from what Blanc is telling us. At least from my point of view, it was a problem in writing the biography. I just couldn't decide where to put it. And I think if I remember, I finally put it while they were still in the founder's own home. Gus, what do you think about that?
I'm inclined to think of it in terms of the Rue Neuve.
Yeah.
But it's just a
Yeah, it could be because for that reason, I suspect, that they no longer had the comfort of the founder's own mansion, for one thing, and they could kind of see where it was going. But there's no real way of making sure by any kind of evidence. Now, on page 70, now there's a sequential problem here, because on page 70, this move took place in 1682, and we know from all sorts of evidence that it was in 1682 that Niel was going around, and in conjunction with the founder, to begin to found these schools outside of Reims. In Rethel, first of all, and then in Guise and Laon, and although he doesn't mention it in the heading here, he does a little later on page 77, a school in the little town of Chateau Porcien. And as Brother Augustine will probably point out to you, the very first of the letters, the oldest of the letters that we have from De La Salle, dates from 1682, and it's addressed to the officials in Chateau Porcien, saying that he will send them teachers to open school on July 1st, and so 1682. So all of this expansion is taking place at the same time. So, but that's another reason why I'm inclined to think that the brothers who left and who were replaced, that may have taken place prior to the move to the Rue Neuve, because he's writing that letter, just prior to the time when he's ready to move out of his own home and move in with them into the Rue Neuve. So he's getting more and more involved in the whole operation. Now, if you go to page 78, 79, after he describes the foundation in these three towns, outlying towns, he starts all over again with them leaving. Bland tells this story twice, as he does so many other things. So he says, towards the bottom of 78, while the devil was busy, De La Salle didn't remain idle. And next paragraph, seeing his sheep ready to take their heels and withdraw, made his heart break. The master's had spoke in vain, his tears were no good, and ra-di-da-di-da, and so on and so forth. But it goes on and all the like, and here a big long thing about trying to get them to stay. So he gets all mixed up with that. Then on page 80, 81, there's where we have the very, very dramatic confrontation. And I guess in recent years it's Michel Sauvage, as much as anybody, who has pointed out, and of course Brother Augustine has stressed this in his own talk, that this was the decisive moment. And Sauvage builds it up, especially in a very, very fine talk he gave back in 1984. And I was there present at the time. That was the year I was in Rome working on the rule. And he made this presentation at the Church of St. Louis of the French in Rome. They were having a series on 17th century spirituality, and he was trying to talk. He was asked to speak about the spirituality of Jean-Baptiste de La Salle. And he saw this incident, and speaking in French to to the French colony in Paris, that's effectively what it was, the French colony in Rome, Michel made this big distinction of what was happening here in sociological terms. Because De La Salle, and it's his view that up to this point, De La Salle was a nice guy, he was pious, but he was very comfortable. He really, up to this point, didn't have to surrender an awful lot. The move with them into the Rue Neuve may have been giving up something after all, but he still had his foot in the other world. There was still a chance to turn back. But when he finally moves in with them, all of a sudden this is a tremendous shock. And we can get a good bit of that from Bland, what he had to do to himself to be able to eat their food, all those gory stories and so on. And just to begin to live with these people, and his own remarks about how he had considered their social condition. But from here on in, this is the conversion moment, this confrontation with the teachers. And it's very typical. Bland does it very well. The nice, pious thing, the birds of the air, trust providence, and all that sort of stuff, as something like Bland himself does all the time. This was one of those loci communes. De La Salle had a whole stock in trade, especially on Providence. And so, talk to these people are worried about the future. As Sauvage says, he could have pulled this thing out of his pocket, huh? And handed them a stock and trade diatribe on the need to trust Providence and so on. And they said, oh, baloney, put your money where your mouth is, or get rid of your money. You have to turn that around. So, and he took it. I'm not so sure it was humorous, but anyway, he certainly, it gave him pause for thought. And so I think that this is the turning point in some ways. And that's another reason why I think 1682 has to be the foundation of the Institute. But now, we have to switch back and forth to follow Bland because he's got everything out of whack. Suppose you go back to page 76. Now, it was undoubtedly at this point where he's bewildered about what these people are challenging him to. And so, of course, we know that he took a long time. He didn't jump to any conclusions right away. But this really hit him where it hurt. And so he spent a long time praying and agonizing over it. Now, a good bit of his praying was probably in the Basilica of St. Remy, but that'll come up again. But apparently at this point, he went to this garden retreat. So look at page 76 at the bottom. In his perplexity, he decided to make a retreat, to beg God for enlightenment and to discover his holy will. To make this retreat in deeper recollection and silence, he rented a small garden near the Augustinian church next to the city walls, rampart. It was on the Rue des Murs, which of course would be Wall Street in the plural. This spot was the first witness of his transports of fervor and of his mortification. After having given his orders to his household and left word at the community assisters entrusted to him by Canon Roland, he withdrew into solitude, letting his spirit plunge in undistractedly into mental prayer and practicing mortification without sparing his body. Declares the memoir which you are transcribing here. Obviously not De La Salle's. He would never say this about himself. If the walls of the tiny room, it's another thing, the tiny room of it, which he used as his cell could speak, what would they not tell us of the bloody disciplines and other pious excesses which he yielded to as a result of the spiritual inebriation which the new wine produces in those who begin to drink deep of it. The blood which bespattered this little cell gave testimony to the holy cruelty with which he treated his flesh and to the sacrifices he made for God. There at the start of a truly new life, he drew up a first plan for the most sublime perfection he ever hoped to realize. Well, you have that thing that I passed out the other day about De La Salle at an auction. Now, one of the things in the estate of his father, Louis de La Salle, had rented this garden annually. Now, the father dies in 1672. But, and this was a rented garden, but since the father had title to it for that year, it was included in the analysis or the assessment of all of the father's valuables. And so from that report, we have an exact description of this particular room. First of all, this garden with the house in it, was 23 meters by 27 meters by 19 meters, roughly 30 meters. And that's about 25 yards. Think of a quarter of a football field, huh? So that was the size of this thing. All right, and the location in the report of the assessors is exactly the same as it is in Bland. That is, adjoining the property of the Augustinians next to the Rue des Murs. So, but the interesting thing is that De La Salle continued to rent this same property annually. He paid the rent for it up until 1683. Okay, so this was part of his own property that he went to for this retreat. The contents are also itemized in the report. And in there was a cabinet, there was 2 tables, there were 8 chairs, huh? You're not going to get 8 chairs into a little cubicle. and there were rakes and hoes and gardening tools of all kinds, etc., etc. And here's what the report says. There's a garden, one of the items is a garden on the Rue des Murs, touching at the rear of the two houses of the congregation of the Augustinians, which are in the Rue of the Augustinians, rented by Father de La Salle pour sa vie naturelle, and sold on his recommendation to a gardener in 1683. So this was, the founder had this for his natural life. Now, what does it mean, natural life? It means for his outdoor life would be a way of putting it. So Rose has a beautiful picture in the cahier where he has produced all this stuff, and he contrasts this with the Blanc thing. That here's where the founder went, put on his overalls, and did some gardening. This is where he got close to nature. Very, very interesting. Yeah? And now, when he's trying to make this decision, he certainly could use it as a retreat for prayer. And if he was into all that scourging, etc., at this point, well, I suppose he gave himself a few wallops. There's nothing against that. But the simple fact of the matter is that this, instead of being the witness to all this bloody stuff and so on and so forth, basically this is where he would often go just to get away from it all, to get some fresh air. Fresh air becomes a big thing with the founder. Keep your eye out for references to fresh air. And he always had a sense of getting close to nature and work with the gardening and so on and so forth. So that's another interesting little, just show, you have to be very, very careful of taking Blanc too literally. Okay, so finally, after whatever prayer and penance and everything else he did, the story, you all know the story, and what he came to. Again, if you go to 86, here again, a marvelous, extensive piece out of the founder's own memoir on the origins. Huh? And forget all the Blanc stuff and all of this business of the drama, etc. Here's the founder's own language, the arguments back and forth, and the motivation. I think that this is an extremely precious document to be aware of in some detail. Huh? Here's where you see John Baptiste de La Salle making up his mind with regard to the Institute and the future, and so on. And so he sees the conflict. I've been reduced to silence. As long as I'm not poor, I have no right to talk the language of perfection I used on the subject of poverty. How can I talk about poverty? Then, two, if I remain what I am, see, notice he still has this mental distance from them, even though he's already moved into the Rue Neuve. And the schoolmasters remain what they are. Their temptation will persist because what it produces will subsist. I won't be able to remedy it because they'll always find an obstacle in my will. Sooner or later, such a temptation will not fail to produce the effect the devil hopes it will. The founder is not beyond talking about the devil after the meeting. The desertion will make a good deal of noise. It will frighten off anybody else who wants to become schoolmasters. Notice he's still calling them schoolmasters. Their vocation, without a stable staff of teachers, the schools will fail. He sees that the future of this whole enterprise depends on having a community, a stable community, to make it work. In this case, the heirs of the foundations will claim the funds. Madame de Croyer, for example, and all of the money that she left. Little by little, the institution of Christian and gratuitous schools, he's already using that term, will be buried beneath its ruins, and it will be useless ever to think of reviving it. He sees clearly what's at stake. Even suppose all this doesn't happen. Must I, can I, even act as the superior of these schoolmasters without giving up my canonry? How can I combine my assiduous presence in the house, so as to be at their head during exercises and keep watch over them? With attendance, how can do that and attend the choir? Are these two positions compatible? If not, I have to give one up. See how logical and how deliberate he is here. True, a canon's prebend is not in itself an obstacle to good work, and so on. And then this famous thing about whether being a canon and saying the office is enough. to keep you occupied. Bland was much preoccupied with that too, because he also was a canon, huh? And he was a little proud of the fact that he did other things at the request of the archbishop. He acted as the supervisor for some religious communities. He was often sent around to do oratory and pull a few of those commonplaces out of his stock and store. But he kind of kept busy. And at one point, they even gave him a parish, which he couldn't stand at all, and got out of that in a hurry. But, so that's the question of, is it possible to be a canon and do other work? Now, what's going to make the balance tip? The greater glory of God, the fuller service of the church, my own higher perfection, and the salvation of souls. Such are the ends I must propose to myself and the aims which govern my choice. There's the motivation. That's the balance. The glory of God. Of course, he incorporates into the vow formula. And as we saw, that was Pierre Fourier's motivation to the sisters, that they could procure the glory of God through the teaching ministry. The fuller service of the church. Fuller service of the church. He's already serving the church as a canon and an advisor to the archbishop. My own higher perfection and the salvation of souls. The relation between his own sanctification and what he could do for others. These are the ends. A powerful sentence. If I consider only these motives, I must resign my canonry and devote myself to the care. And then finally, this number 10, which I guess the superiors kept from us for years and years and years, because they used to get very nervous when anybody ever spoke about a temporary vocation. Whereas here we have clear evidence in the founder's own words that he thought his vocation as a canon was a temporary vocation. Very strong. I no longer feel any attraction to the vocation of a canon. It would seem it has already left me even before I have given up this state of life. I suppose it's dangerous nowadays to underscore this too much with some of the brothers. We're losing enough of them as it is. But this is his own way of putting it. This calling is no longer for me. While I entered it through the right gate, it seems to me that God is opening another door before me today so that I may leave it. The same voice that called me to it seems to be calling me elsewhere. I hear this in the depths of my conscience. This voice speaks when I consult my conscience. True, since the hand of God put me in the state in which I now am, his hand must take me out of it. But is he not showing me clearly enough today another state that deserves the preference and towards which he is leading me by the hand? So those 10 paragraphs are powerful and precious, I think. Then Bland goes on, to tell the entire truth, De La Salle considered the canon's function as one of the least significant in the church. And he goes on, he said so many times in the memoir he wanted to be fully a priest and exercise it. He felt he was burying his talents, and so on and so forth. And then in the next paragraph, today the title of canon dispenses many from an active ministry. It can be said such was not always the case. We go back to the beginning, and we must admit that only those lack either the talents or the bishop's consent are to. So he's talking, of course, about his own situation in Rouen as a canon. Right. So, as Bland himself says on the next page, page 89, in the middle paragraph there, at this point I think of De La Salle as resembling a man who has stopped at a spot where various paths emerge. So he's at the crossroads. Now he's contradictory here above, in that paragraph above. He says this longing had remained with him ever since Father Roland had suggested he exchange his canonry for a parish, and it had not been extinguished by the fact that to obey his ordinary he had to give up the idea. But in that three-way deal that we saw earlier, De La Salle himself says that he knew perfectly well that God had never intended him to be a parish priest, so it wasn't that attraction necessarily at all. The decision of a superior convinced him he was not called to be a parish priest, but to remain a canon. Well, down at the bottom. Finally, after much reflection in God's presence, after many prayers, it seemed evident to him towards the end of the year 1682, as he himself writes, now here's some more of the memoir, that God was calling me to take charge of the schools, since he had to be the first at all the exercises, etc.
Convinced at last by all the reasons we have enumerated above, he made up his mind to resign his canonry. Even so, he found his spiritual director still unwilling to agree to this change. And so now we go through the whole business of the spiritual director. So Bland then gives us 2 full pages defending the spiritual director, whose advice was wrong, of course. Now there's 2 problems there, of course. How did De La Salle manage finally to convince the spiritual director, number 1? And the other question is, who is this spiritual director? Huh? So that's when things, so we have this big, long thing about a typical apologetic of Bland for 2 whole pages in all these paragraphs of defending the spiritual director even when they give the wrong advice. So when the spiritual director is against it, on page 92, he decides to go to Paris to consult the wisest and most enlightened persons in the kingdom. But he still keeps getting to all sorts of different advices. And so everybody's going at him one after the other. But finally, of course, he prevails. Now the question is, who is this spiritual director? I think, as we'll see a little later on when the name finally gets mentioned, it seems to me that probably the spiritual director, through all this period after the death of Roland, his consistent spiritual director through this whole time was Jacques Calou, the priest who was the rector of the major seminary in Reims. Gus, you think so? And so he's consulting all around with all sorts of other people, huh? It's Calou, for example, when it comes to question of whether he should go immediately to Paris or not, or stay in Reims. It's Calou who convinces him that he should stay in Reims, even though Barré wants him to go to Paris, and Barmondier wants him to go to Paris, and so on. But the spiritual director says, no, you should stay in Reims to keep the thing going. All right. Page 95, we get another, in the middle paragraph, the spiritual director is, this apparently is reflecting the spiritual director's advice. Why does he make everyone talk about him so much? Why give the irreligious an occasion to make fun of religion, etc., etc.? What a blot on his reputation if he's unhappy with the decision. If he remains firm in his resolve, which he may well do since he is so hard-headed, what a spectacle will he not offer to the world when he, a canon, becomes a schoolmaster, when he places himself at the head of a band of beggars and becomes a beggar like them. So there's the old hard-headed De La Salle again. Then we get page 102, the decision is heroic. The whole business of resigning his canonry in favor of this Flaubert, the marvelous thing about what finally happens to Flaubert, takes 8 men to carry out his body when he dies. He just gets fatter and fatter and fatter all the time. It's on page 110 that we get Calou identified and so on. Then at the very end of this first volume, the whole question of what to do with the money now that he's given it away. And then, of course, the famine comes along and the distribution. Notice how carefully the distribution is done and how he gets the ecclesia, all of those paintings of the founder at the door and the brothers giving out the bread right, left, et cetera, and the beggars, et cetera. Well, it was much more organized than that. He divides them into 3 groups, these others help them, and of course apparently a good bit of that was to make sure that the routine of the schools kept going and that the kids themselves would be the first ones to take advantage of it. And the amount of money, Blanc says 40,000 livres was what he gave away. Battersby extrapolates that into several $1 million, but that's probably a little kind of exaggerated. When he gives away finally all of his patrimony, he keeps, as Brother Augustine has pointed out and emphasized, he keeps enough money in trust to be able to receive a stipend of 200 livres a year for his books and for his travels and for other necessities, at the advice of his director. the whole business of whether or not the school should be endowed, and Barre's advice, endow them only on providence, and that was a decision he makes. So the money doesn't go to the schools at this point, although he's not beyond using some of his personal resources as time goes on over the course of his life. And needless to say, after this gesture of divesting himself of anything to fall back on, the founder still has, he continues to acquire property, he continues to receive grants and so on. When his grandmother dies in 1691, she leaves her extensive, the whole Brouilly estate, she leaves to be divided among her 3 sons and her only daughter's heirs, which would include De La Salle and all of his living brothers and sisters. So the LaSalle family got 1/4 of Perret L'Espagnol's property, very extensive property and wealth out there, and so he had. It's like the rich man in the gospel. If he left everything, gave everything away to follow Christ and come follow me, he would have had to start all over again with the rest of them. The apostles had a purse, which Judas kept. So it's impossible to actually give away everything literally. But it certainly was a dramatic and a heroic gesture. That finishes this first volume. Is there anything that you would like to raise or that struck you that I passed over too quickly? As I said, I've highlighted a few things. Maybe you would like to highlight a few things. Chris?
Yeah, I'd like to get a handle on what the founder might have meant at that time by the institution of Christian schools, mentioned in the memoir of this decision that he made, given at Canterbury. How many schools were in existence at that time? Was he looking beyond Reims already, or that the Champagne area? Was he thinking of something of a real national system?
No, not necessarily, I don't think. I think it's a little premature for that. But at this moment, there are 3 schools and maybe 4 in Reims, and there are 3 schools. There are 3, maybe 4 outside of Reims. So it's a network of 6 schools. And I think when he uses that term, he's using the same term that Barre used in Rouen for a similar local network of schools. Now, his vision expands beyond that as he gets more and more involved, and especially when he sees the implications of Letellier's offer, and there's pressure for him to go to Paris from Barre, who's trying to, all the time, right from very early on, convince him that if this thing is ever going to amount to anything, it ought to be located in Paris instead of way up in the provincial capital of Reims. But when he uses this expression in this context, I think he feels that this network of the 6 or 7 schools is already sufficiently worthwhile and doing enough good. That would be my response to that. Does it make any sense to you? Fergus?
Just wondered how he defined the will of God in his regard. Like in this case here, he didn't get the answer he wanted from his spiritual director, so he shopped around.
He shops around.
He gets the one he wants.
Yeah, yeah. He gets it in his conscience first, I think. He gets some sense, that God's telling him something, but he always wants it sanctioned by somebody else. But if he has his mind made up on something, it seems to me, he's not all that totally docile and obedient to the spiritual director. Or if he first of all tries to persuade the director, I can imagine having him as well, I don't do spiritual direction, but some of you do. Imagine having De La Salle as one of your clients, And there must be a hell of a lot of dialogue goes on with a man like that, who sees pretty much, who may be well ahead of the director in trying to discern what God's calling him to do. But that's an area outside of my own experience, so I'd better not say too much about it. I've probably said too much already.
And second, just would he have paid the schoolmasters? There's no mention there at all when he's a schoolmaster living in the house of them being paid.
Oh, yeah, sure there is, because, right, remember Madame de la Croyer, or de Croyer, whatever her name was? She endowed all of those things, but every one of those was somehow endowed.
Yeah, but when they're giving out about him and asking him to give up his money, they never mention wages in it. It just seems to be totally nothing.
Well, as we saw when we tried to analyze how far 150 livres would go, this was mere subsistence pay. And their attitude is if the schools fall apart, will be left out on the street. As he himself says in his own reflections, if the school's closed, there'll never be any way of getting them back again, and the money from the foundations will go back to the original people who endowed the school. So that source of revenue would dried up for them. But they were getting barely enough just to be able to live on it, to subsist.
I wonder, was it just came to ruin the board? Whether he actually
Well,
made
the money, I presume that he had some control over the money, but there was just barely enough to support them. I don't think he gave them a salary.
Oh, that's so.
Oh, if that's what you mean. No, I don't think so.
It seems that in the material that we've covered so far, a shift is taking place from the focus being on the schools to the focus being on the stability in the community that's being organized.
That's interesting thought, yeah. But I think the two are so closely intertwined all along, because as we saw from those earlier things in the century, those earlier attempts to reform a school here, there, it was spotty, and there was no stable community organized to make sure that these things would continue. And that's why I use the word network a little bit, because it was the network that kept kept the schools being supported all the time. Does that make any sense? So it's precisely the community that makes that assures the survival of the school. But we must also remember that Bland is writing a biography of the person of the founder too, and so he's not going to be too involved in the whole business of how the schools were run and the methodology and all that. That comes in the conduit, of course, and that's the whole. You'll get to that in Buttimer 2 next year.
It seems that in the beginning, Lasallian seemed to figure out what was a good technique for running the school, but then he couldn't keep the people who he had trained. And then the focus to accomplish the task of education, he really had to focus in on getting people to stay after the training that he gave.
Yeah, but the training doesn't change, does it? I'm not sure that I understand what the problem is.
Well, I mean, I don't see a problem, but I see a switch as far as emphasis.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That his direction was more towards their spiritual development and stability.
Yeah, but what I see as the consistency, though, is from the minute he first got involved with them, he wanted to get them into a pattern of living a regular, stable type of lifestyle, and that stable lifestyle would have all the elements. That they would pray together, that he would give them a spiritual vision and a deep personal spirituality. They'd start with that, but then they would have discipline in the school. Having learned to discipline themselves, there would be discipline in the school. And they would always teach by association together. That comes up all the way through this thing. You would never send one out. That's a very important part of the policy decision. And then going on from that this then became a regular way in which they conducted their schools. And then there was evidence that, for example, the management of schools, the conduit, was put together probably out of these discussions they'd have at the end of the day, and there's reference to that, about how things went in the school. So little by little, just as Gabe Healy was saying the other night, it became a kind of a collective wisdom about what you do when you get into the school. It takes him a long while before he gives them anything like a formal novitiate. I guess maybe that's what he was saying. Peter.
Just, I guess, in response to that, it would make sense if it seems that the founder would shift the emphasis to the formation or development of the school community, because he saw that as necessary to the survival of the school.
Yeah.
Even yesterday, he was talking about the way Lasallian shifted the runners around. And that there seems to be emphasis on the school, but on the needs of the individual as well.
Yeah, but
My understanding is that everything was so standardized that if you shift somebody from here to here, they would do the same thing no matter where they
exactly,
were.
exactly. Great deal of uniformity in the method. Gus, you wanted to make a comment?
Well, I just think it points up the centrality of the vow of association,
Yeah.
the original vow.
Yeah, right.
That he built the whole idea of an association, but it wasn't just for the sake of associating, it was for the school.
Yeah. Don?
I find it interesting that all of a sudden he switches to the memoir to quote verbatim the 10-point
except I suppose internal evidence. And it strikes me as so different and so, so conformity, so consistent with everything we know about the founder.
Do we actually have?
But we don't have the text, that's the problem. So the text has to be reconstructed. And of course, the other thing is that in the French text itself, it's set off in quotation marks in a different type. Gus?
Physics Paul points out that when Blaine quotes letters, of which we have the original, Blaine is faithful to the quote, he does not acknowledge. We don't have a lot of evidence, but what evidence do you have is that Blaine is faithful to his sources.
Ron? Did you have your hand up? George?
Your comment on that term process, I guess it's the foundation of the institute.
Yeah.
As a process. Well, here, being a biologist, here's a couple analogies, or one analogy comes to my mind. You could talk a new human being. We put emphasis the day you are born, but there's a process of formation that's going on before the actual event, which we call the birth. And so we like to say these are different things happening, but I like to take the event is when they first made a vow, which I think is 84 or something like that. It's not mentioned there yet. But maybe all these things leading up to this group of men make a promise to live together, then that's the event that starts the institution. Or another one that comes to my mind is just our novitiate. The novitiate is a process of religious formation. It culminates in the event of making vows at the end. So I would like to, maybe with regard to when did our institute start? Well, the event would be the vows. And before that were some process going on leading up to that event.
Yeah. Two comments. First of all, I agree with you. The analogy is fit and apt. I wouldn't take the vows, though. I would take the movement to the Rue Neuve, where they formed a community, because that was their commitment to association. But there are some problems with the vows. An analogy I would use in that regard, from theology and history, is the process by which the church was founded. When Jesus Christ went to heaven, they were still all Jews. Huh? There was no Catholic Church at that time. Not at all. It certainly did. And it took a long time for the church to emerge, and an even longer time for the papacy to emerge, as I hinted at the other day. That there were no bishops. By the time we get to the end of the New Testament, we still don't have any local bishop any place. We still do not have a Eucharistic sacrifice. A lot of things we don't have. We don't have any practice of the sacrament of penance. At the end of the New Testament, it takes time for these things to develop. At what moment do you want to say we've got the Catholic Church? Maybe we haven't got it yet. A lot of hands. Michael?
Kind of this whole thing is a point of reflection that this whole decision-making process of the founder developed this academy and began schoolmasters and so forth. I see a lot of analogies in the present day that maybe look at the next few years, maybe chapter, as maybe this is what we're being called to do today, is to take another significant step, and that is to move through this whole concept of association, what it means for today. Perhaps giving up some of the things we're so used to. It's what be analogous to the founder giving up his canonry, and maybe what we're going to plunge into is just as offensive to some of the brothers as it was to the founder to plunge into the community life with the schoolmasters. That's what strikes me in all of this.
See, in one sense, the foundation and the founders and the pioneers, in a certain sense, always have an easier time of it, at least, because most of the time they're starting something new, and it's the sociologists have analyzed this about the charismatic leader and the first disciples. So they're filled with enthusiasm, filled with freshness, they're breaking ground, they're breaking into something new, and the results are apparent immediately. De Lasallian, even in 1682, they could begin to see before their very eyes how the famous expression, the need of this institute is very great,
They saw the need, they saw they were fulfilling it, they saw the difference that they made. Huh? When you're involved in an institution that is 300 years old and more or less with its own ways set and embedded and so on, it's not so easy to see that you're all that needed when everybody else is doing the same thing and some people doing it even better. Huh? And so I think that's what's confronting the Institute. As we begin now to talk more and more, what is it the characteristic of our schools in today's world? Or what are we being called to do that maybe has nothing to do with the schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Exactly, I agree with you completely. Okay?
That's what I was going to ask, and that's a good question for me, because I was wondering, it seems to be easy to identify what the identity of this group was at the time of LaSalle. If you try to grapple with that problem today, the word identity gets so amorphous and we're caught up in the culture and a million things. So I think that's a very valid point.
I think it's emerging. That was the point I tried to make last year at the convocation. That it is an institute in a process of transition. And I like the reflection in the founder's meditation for the Feast of St. Barnabas, which occurs in the middle of June, that he said they set off, St. Barnabas set off, going out into like a man going out into the open sea without the sail and without oars. And I think perhaps maybe that's where we are. But the founder, that is a part of his own experience. He didn't really know what was going to come. Frank?
I'm just amazed at the amount of time that the founder spent, not in pure spirituality, but in introspection. As I look at these 10 points here, it's almost a model of logic, where this man sits by himself and point by point, without even going into the spiritual religious, logically he lines up his arguments and so on. And I am supposed to imitate him, but introspection such as he displays here, can be a very dangerous activity. You have to maintain balance and so on, you see, and this man can do that. Today, with all the guidelines and so on for introspection and so on, it becomes a very painful process and it can be quite harmful to mental health. But that's what I find these 10 points.
How do you know?
How do I know
I'm
what?
sorry. That it can be harmful to mental health, But no, I agree. But would you say that that's all introspection? I mean, there are external reference, huh? There is the good to be done by the schools. And what will happen if he doesn't see it? There's the objectivity of the vocation of the canon, huh? And his referent point always is, what does God want? So I think it is true. It's logical, huh? And he's thinking it through. But I think he's not just thinking it through out of his own insides. If you look at those things closely, you'll see all those other elements there. Jack?
Something about what Michael said and what Gabe was saying. When you were going through those things, 86 through 88, the 10 points that LaSalle said significant in decision-making process. It reminds me of what some of what I hear from a lot of young men today. Like, why be a brother? I can do this, and I want to be a doctor or I want to be a teacher. And the whole question of identity, of our place, and the question that you raised, like the need of this institute is very great, and it's not as dramatically seen, perhaps by younger people today. I'm curious, like in what we've read about so far, we got De La Salle being invited by Roland and Neil and all these other guys, and his eyes being open and seeing this. What do we know about the first schoolmaster, and what was involved, and how did they get involved? How did perhaps Neil? What did he say to them? How did they come off the streets to come into this? Is it just social, like moving up in the society, having something over your head? But then when we read about the habit, they're getting all this abuse, and what keeps them?
Well, I think that, the answer to that is in the text, though. Their attraction to the work is part of it. Their attraction to the founder is certainly part of it. Their attraction to this particular type of lifestyle, which was different and a kind of an adventure. Some of the early ones, I think DL just picked them up because they were wandering around jobless and so on. Well, here was something that at least they'd get enough to eat and so on. And those are the ones that left. But then new recruits came because again, I think the results were tangible. And it looked like an interesting thing that they could do without too many requirements. They didn't have to know anything really or have any special qualities. But then little by little, as we'll see as we begin to get into this second volume, is that people of fairly good means began to be attracted to it. And I think, as some of you have already raised, that raises the question of something like the Moonies. Why do perfectly normal kids get attracted to some of those sects of that kind? And so it's the same thing. It's hard to analyze. I'm not sure I have. Bill?
I just want to mention that it says that St. LaSalle never turned anybody away who applied to be a brother, and yet we have all this screening process and so on. I was wondering how we changed over the years.
Oh, well, that only started when we began to get psychologists in the outfit. I remember one time when there were 3 candidates for the Visitor of New York, and Brother Augustine was one, and I was the other, and I think Johnny Martin was the third. And that was a time, it was back in the 60s, when all the psychologists were really going strong and heavy in those days. And somebody asked me in the question period what I thought about the psychologists. And I said, I think we should do away with them, because if we have all of this screening of candidates, what are we going to do for superiors if we drum out all the crazies? Needless to say, I was not elected the Visitor. And Gus was. All right, let's go to the second volume. We have, 64 pages in this to finish up yesterday's assignment. Andrew, do you have a question?
Yes, St. LaSalle set out, divided by twos,
Yeah.
with these places around Reims. Would they have any relationship with the founder except by mail during that time, or would they come back to Reims occasionally?
Well, that's not completely clear. The distances weren't that great, though. They could make the trip back and forth overnight, but if they had to run their own school, there were always 2 of them together. And the schools up in the north, those little towns are not that far apart. And remember, in the beginning, it was Niel who was involved with at the beginning, Niel had the ones outside Reims, and the founder kept the 3 schools in Reims itself, of course, they all lived in the Rue Neuve. They all lived in the same house. So it was only gradually that outside group got involved with the Reims group, because they were more or less in Niel's hands. And I presume that he had kept some supervisory role, and as you see, or we haven't seen it yet, but he will be increasingly ask De La Salle to take the responsibility for those people. And so you can be sure that De La Salle himself probably visited them. Well, we see some instances here. Okay. But then little by little, but the idea of bringing them all together regularly doesn't come until we get to Paris. Okay.
The map here book doesn't bring that out too well. He just mentions Niel much later on.
Yeah. Well, that's why I prefer the Blanc thing, because it's considerably more detailed. Okay. All right. Let's see if we can get through some of this section in the next. Well, there are a lot of interesting little details here, and we can go over some of them rather quickly, I think. This would probably come under the rubric of life at the Rue Neuve. And I think most of you have read this all, and there's not an awful lot to say about it. I think on page 2, where he talks about the fact that not everybody is aware of, that when he moved into the Rue Neuve, it was large enough house. Now this business of little cubicle where the founder is, forget all of that, huh? That may have been the case, and the cubicle isn't that small. When later on, towards the end of his life, when he's in Grenoble, he's living in a very small little room at the top of the house and only shows up for exercise. But Blanc keeps putting that every place he is, he's got a little cubicle of a room. Now, most of these houses were large, rambling things, so I'm inclined to think that he's just putting that in every once in a while as again one of his standard buttons that he pushes. But anyway, he says on page 2 here that these ecclesiastics were in the house, and this, of course, was probably a source of revenue for the house too, to help support them. And one of them was Faubert and so on. And Faubert also had some seminarians that he was training in the house at the same time. And so De La Salle realized that the two ought to split. So he gives Faubert the bigger of the two sections of the house. But then finally he has to go and get the bigger one. And that's, if you got that map of Reims, that's right at that triangular corner there where the brothers eventually got the whole thing. We have the business of what the founder had to do in order to be able to eat the food, including swallowing his vomit over and over again, and not very appetizing. On page 6, the story of the absinthe. That's a good story. It's a good example, of showing how detached the founder. Here's the not interested in food, typical Saint-Sulpice stuff. Remember old Tronson telling them to eat their meals in a sense of. So we get the absinthe, and absinthe makes the food grow fonder or something. But we'll get the absinthe story again when they're at Vaugirard. So don't be surprised when we come to Vaugirard if we get the absinthe story again. Now, it obviously didn't happen twice. Damn near poisoned the ball. That's been happening in the Institute ever since, too. Page 8, that's where we get the vigils in the Basilica of Saint-Remy. It's worth dwelling on that just for a moment or two. Have you got that map of Reims with you still that I gave out yesterday? Take a look at where that is. Now, locate the Rue Neuve again where the first community is there, right in that triangular thing with the little slit between the two houses. And then go all the way over to the right to the edge of the thing, and there's where the Basilica of Saint Remy is. And look at notice the size of it, by the way, compared, for example, to the size of the cathedral. It's not quite as long as the cathedral is, but it's considerably wider, actually, in scale. And it really is a huge, big basilica, a very barren basilica, but it's got 3 portals in the front of it, and it's an enormous place. And that's where St. Remy, who converted, supposedly baptized Clovis, his tomb is there, a great big enormous thing and so on. And that apparently is where the founder, on at least one occasion, had the sacristan lock him up for the weekend. Of course, Bland has him doing it, spending all of his weekends locked up in the basilica, which may, again, be something of an exaggeration. But if you got a good story, why not tell it over 4 or 5 times every chance you get? So have some idea. And you see the distances there, again, at that scale. So, then Bland, just to show you how remember he's in Rouen, writing in Rouen, where the founder died, where he's a canon and so on and so forth. So he tends, things from his own experience in Rouen, he tends to put back. Look on page 8 in the 3rd paragraph there. This great attraction for complete solitude and unceasing contemplation brought him sometime later to the retreat house of the Discalced Carmelite Fathers at Louviers, a few miles from Rouen. Well, why put that in here, where he's still in Reims, and all that sort of stuff, but he gets things, he can't resist the temptation when he thinks of something just to throw it in there. Whether it fits or not, he's not the least bit interested in sequence part. This priest, the parish priest of the St. Peter's in Laon, this Pierre Guillard is his name. We'll see him later, considerably later, when the trouble with the cardinal begins to develop. The brothers there, he was very close to the brothers in Laon, and he interfered a little bit, or at least he tried to find out what was going on that occasion. We'll see that later. Page 11, there's a big emphasis here on consultation again. But now here again, De La Salle calls together his principal disciples. Now in this whole story, De La Salle has this meeting. I suppose this would be, in a certain sense, the 1686, right? And this is sometimes known as the First General Assembly. Now, Bland says, I forget which one is which. My affair says 1684 and Bland says 86, or is it the other way around? 84. And My affair says 86, and most of us now think it's 86. 84 is a little too soon. 84 is probably when the habit was adopted, and I gave you that sheet yesterday, which I presume you have read. Huh? So the habit came first, and then the name, and then probably this assembly. Now it says he picked the first 12 12 principal brothers. Well, again, I think that he's thinking here, and then 4 of the 12 left the next year or something. Well, I think again he's confusing here this and 1694. If he had a general assembly, it was probably all of the brothers. There's no reason why any of them would have been excluded. There's nothing to distinguish one from the other, and there aren't that many houses. In 1694 at Vaugirard in Paris, after the heroic vow, and when the Institute is getting pretty well settled, this is tomorrow's work, then he brings 12 brothers, and they're the ones who make the first final vows. Okay. And it's the same thing with the discussion here about vows. Blount talks about that whole vow discussion almost as if it were the same discussion that took place in 1694, and it's premature to think about it that way. Huh? So I think Blount is, again, he's jumping the gun a little bit too much in his description of this important assembly. It's interesting that in the history of the Institute, the choice of whether you're going to take 1684 or whether you're going to take 1686 is sometimes influenced by what's going on in the present-day general chapters. In the general chapter of 1934, after the chapter was over, the Superior General and a large number of the capitulants went to Rheims and made a pilgrimage to the shrine of Our Lady of Liesse, where the founder went at the end of this assembly after the brothers first pronounced vows, on an overnight pilgrimage from Rheims. And so the Superior General and a lot of the capitulants went from Rheims to Liesse, to the shrine of Our Lady of Liesse, and there's a stained glass window now in that shrine showing there the brothers, the general chapter of 1934, going there because it was the 250th anniversary of the first assembly. Huh? Whereas when we had the general chapter in 1986, we had it in 1986, and thereby the official date was 1686 because that was the 300th anniversary of the thing. Huh? So that's an example where the previous choice of a date did not prevail. But it's interesting that in the history in the literature of the Institute, this is always referred to as the first General Assembly, but it is not considered a general chapter. The first general chapter in the counting, the most recent one was the 41st, but the first general chapter in the counting is the general chapter of 1617, just as the first Superior General is Brother Bartholomew and not the founder. 1717, I'm sorry. Okay. All right, so that's the story of this. Now on page 14, good old Blount, he's thinking like a canonist and an ecclesiastic. And this whole question of vows. And he's going on this big long song and dance about chastity and poverty and all that sort of stuff. Again, I suspect most of that discussion, probably if it took place at all, took place in 1694 and not on the occasion of this first assembly. The question, obviously, all they could do would be to make a private vow. And again, it wasn't exactly, the first one wasn't so much association, it was the first vow. They decided, well, one thing from the tradition that would help hold them together. See, there again, the problem of stability would be a vow of obedience. So, and the founder, this was one of the questions he proposed to them. Should we solidify this enterprise by asking you to commit yourself to it before the Lord, and to take upon yourself before the Lord some kind of a permanent commitment, or some kind of a commitment that would be see, this is why, George, the vow thing, they're already, in a sense, as the founder says, committed, all right? And if you read that thing that Maurice Hermans wrote, by his interpretation when he writes the memoir on the habit, is that by putting on the habit, you are already committed and consecrated, you see? So the consecration or the commitment is a distinct thing from making the vows. And I think that's one of the things we begin to see more and more, because the founder's concept of being committed to this work is putting on the habit and joining the community and forming the community. Whereas then it's a question of, well, are you going to express this by vows? And is everybody going to take the vows? Or are just some people going to take the vows? And that was the situation in the Institute all the way up until 1917. And then what vows? Here, the first time, they make a vow of obedience. The heroic vow is a vow to found the Institute, to associate to found the Institute. The 1694 vows are vows of stability, obedience, and association to keep gratuitous schools. See? And now we take, I took originally final vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, teaching the poor gratuitously, and stability. So brothers have been taking all sorts of different vows over the years. The vows are an expression of this commitment. So at this stage of the game, the thing that's most in focus is obedience. The other question that's open here is, for how long was it? And it seems to be contradictory as you read it, that it was a vow for 1 year, but then they're talking about a vow for 3 years. And what it seems to be is that they took the vow for 3 years, renewable annually. And that was the practice of temporary vows in the Institute all the way up through the 19th century. That was the case, for example, with Brother Mushin Marie. His first temporary vows were triennials, but then they had to apply to renew them. Then they would renew them each year, so that kept pushing the date further back, and he was refused the first time around.
Just to back up, it was an interesting observation. In our institute, when you talk about when you, a big date is like when you became a brother.
Yeah.
You put down when you received the habit, the beginning of officiate. But many other religious orders, it's when you make the first vow, they put down the starting date. And so this is
that's a good observation. And it is true too.
I have two
Sure.
sisters that are nuns, and so their end of the novitiate is the date they put down, their golden jubilee and all this kind of stuff, after from the end of the novitiate.
First
Ours
vow.
is from the beginning of the novitiate, when you see they have it.
And that's canonical thinking again, that vow thing, whereas I think our tradition really is, right, your brother from the start. Okay, see you at 11 o'clock. We have just a little bit of this finished yesterday. And you may want to say some things about them. So, we're talking about the life on the Rue Neuve. Before we get to that General Assembly, now, of course, the part of the problem here is that what are we going to do about the sequence? But since we're talking about, first of all, is there anything more about that business of the vows? All right, and so Frank asked about, what about authorization for this? Remember, these were private vows which anybody can make any time, preferably under the direction of a spiritual director. And so, although they all took them, for each one it was a private vow, and the only binding force was the force that it had before God. The Institute has no public vows until the Bull of Approbation comes 6 years after the death of the founder. So all of these vow things are purely private commitments before the Lord. And there is therefore only that intrinsic binding force, which to my mind is the only intrinsic binding force that vows have anyway. But so that's anything about vows. All right, now what about the habit? So the habit probably was adopted before this business of before the assembly, and I passed out that sheet from Maurice Hermans, and maybe there's a couple of things he says about the habit on that page. Have you got it? The first taking of the habit at Reims in 1684. See, Maurice was very conscious of the fact that we were observing the 300th anniversary of all these things. On the second page, see, this is the same point we've been talking about. His whole point is that this was a way of going public. This, after a couple of years together, 4 years actually, since the foundation of the first school, this group of schoolmasters, which is now totally under the control of John Baptist LaSalle, and with the 6 or 7 schools operating, that they decide that it's time for let everybody know that what they're up to, and that there's something different. Okay? So he says in the last 3 paragraphs here of this second page, that first taking of the habit was meant precisely to witness to this fact. He has interesting things up above about why there are no hooks and things up, why there are no buttons. Before their pupils, before the parishioners of Reims, Rethel, and elsewhere, the brothers, wearing this habit, professed. See, the word profession, huh? This is the profession. Their membership of a community, which was not to be confused with any other. Neither ecclesiastic, they weren't diocesan. Neither secular, they were not ordinary lay people. Nor regular. Regular, of course, means belong to a religious order, which Bland consistently forgets. He's always bringing in what other religious orders do, in the sense in which the church understood. So from a technical, canonical sense of what is an ecclesiastic, a member of an order, a regular order, or a secular, the disciples of Monsieur de La Salle insisted on their identity as brothers of the Christian schools. Since the adoption of this habit, states the memoir, a person has no other idea when he asks for admission but to join a community and remain there for the rest of his life. This is 2 years before they take a vow. He does not know what it is to ask for wages and considers himself happy to be accepted. It is the habit alone which produces these effects. So and it's preserved in the Mother House. Anybody want to say anything about that? Now, of course, the business of ridicule, as I suggested, there was an incident, apparently a severe incident one time in Rouen, where the brothers were, they threw stones and mud and so on and so forth. But Bland has them doing that all day, every day, which is very unlikely. But the habit was a very distinctive thing. Are you all familiar with what the habit looked like? You got a kind of an idea of it last night when Pat McNally appeared and of course the founder kept making the brim wider and wider and wider. Here's a picture. It's in Battersby. It's also in my biography. But there's what the habit looked like, huh? Now, it doesn't look like what brothers wear around our schools now. Can you kind of see that? So there's the broad brim hat flopping all over the place. It wasn't the tricorps, the three-quarter job, or the Roman hat, all of which were adopted much later. But this was the floppy thing with the big, thick boots and the robe coming down only to the just at the calf, huh? Just below the knee, because the ecclesiastics liked to wear them all the way down to the ground, and that was an excuse very often for having a little train behind, because your status in ecclesiastical circles depends on how long your train is, huh? I remember when we were scholastics in Washington, and so they'd have these big ceremonies in the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. And on some big days, like the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which was the patronal feast of the United States and the university, etc., they'd have a whole procession of archbishops and the apostolic delegate. They usually didn't have a cardinal, because if a cardinal came, it would upset who was head of who. But then they all had these big, long Capomagna things with a big, long train behind, carried by some little altar boy and the thing. Now, you know the origin of that, of course.
No.
Well, when these bishops would travel around, of course, they traveled by horse. Huh? And so when they sat on the horse with these big, long capes and so on, the thing had to be long enough to keep the horse's ass warm. Huh? That's the origin of the thing. So every bishop had a horse and a horse's ass, but it was a warm. Well, anyway, so the founder wanted none of that. There was no temptation that you'd have a train or a train bearer with that type of an outfit. Huh? And then, of course, underneath they just wore little short pants. Huh? John Paul II created a scandal when he was first elected Pope, when he wore black pants underneath his white robe. That's the first Pope in history ever to wear a pair of pants, for crying out loud. He soon got rid of them, by the way. So all they ever wore underneath were these big, long stockings called the bas, B-A-S. They say that in the general chapter of 1923, the major issue for discussion in that general chapter was whether or not the brothers would have to continue to wear the bas and what they would be made out of, those long stockings, little short pants, and then a kind of an undershirt, which they changed once a week, whether they needed it or not. Well, so that's the habit. Anything about the habit? Yes, Chris?
Luke, on the paper that you gave us,
Yes.
saw that. There's Maurice writes, he therefore wrote this memoir to justify his decision in the eyes of his ecclesiastical superiors.
Yes, we'll come to that. We'll talk about it here. Let's wait till Paris for that. We'll talk about the memoir. I would just want to the significance of the habit at this point. So they established several policies at this meeting. The habit had already been adopted. They decided from now on they're going to be called brothers and not school teachers. They will only go to schools. The founder had already seen the importance of that, 2 by 2, that he would not send a brother anywhere alone. And what else? Am I forgetting something? But those are the basic decisions of that first General Assembly. And he did it together, and at the end, then they discussed the business of vows. They finally decided, well, yes, some of them are ready to make a vow of obedience, which they did, and the next day they made a pilgrimage, all starting early in the morning and fasting, walking the 30 miles or so to the shrine of Our Lady of Liesse. It's about 25, 30 miles. So they walked up there, got there in time for Mass, left early enough in the morning, got there in time for Mass, which the founder celebrated. They renew their vows in that chapel, which is still there, and you can still visit it. And I explained there's the stained glass window there. I have a slide of it I may show you if we get around to that. And then they came back that same day. So that's that chapter. Now, one of the things that coming to more of those things on the life and the Rue Neuve, a lot of you were concerned about this business of, well, you've been using the word occult. Do you mean sect, huh? Well, we have to think, what about those 3 brothers who died? Huh? One of them, by the way, was De La Salle's pet. You know, he had a special liking for this one. He was selective, apparently, that Morris. And the Bourlet fellow, these people came from pretty good families, as the story goes. Have you any comment on that? And here they were lacerating themselves. About 6 of them died, and Arose has gathered the death certificates of some of them. They're all dying very young, popping off with the austerity and everything. And there's evidence, too, that when they began to die, the founder, as you'll see in the beginnings thing, the founder then began to mitigate some of the things that they had agreed to do as part of their lifestyle thing. But that often has, you know, when any of these things are beginning, it's, you know, the Moonies thing, when we read about, you don't hear so much about them anymore. Of course, as you know, they have a training center in what was our novitiate in Barrytown. And I remember when they first settled in there, there was one of them who left and was disillusioned with them, wrote a big article for the New York Daily News, a big expose of what was going on up there in Barrytown with the Moonies. And he said it was inhuman, the existence they had. They got up at the crack of dawn in the morning, very early in the morning. They had them working out in the fields without any pay. The food was meager and barely enough to subsist on. They were not allowed to, their parents were not allowed to come and visit them, and they had no contact with the outside world. They were brainwashed all day long into the Mooney philosophy and so on and so forth. And I felt like saying, well, what else is new? That's exactly what they did to us. And it was. It's the same technique, and it's the same tactics in the social control and the thought control and everything else and so on and so forth. And then a whole structure, an international structure, whereby the visiting general would come around and report directly to the superiors in Rome, and skipping over all of the provincials in between, so that there was no way anybody could escape from this surveillance. And one time my father was a traveling salesman. That's where I got some of my stories. And so one time he was in the neighborhood, and I saw the family car parked over there by the juniorate, and he knew one of the brothers there. And so I saw the family car, and I said, oh, God, my father's here. And so on and so forth. But apparently he came to the director of novices and asked if he could see me. So the director of novices said, sure, yes, you may see dear brother Celestin Luke. But he said, of course, you know, he has only 4 visits a year, so if you see him this time, that counts as one of them. So he figured he didn't want to sacrifice the family visit. So those were the days, my friend. Would you want to call our novitiate, you know, the seed beds of a sect or something like that? Is that what was behind those questions? Does somebody want to pursue that further? But you see, it's anybody who started, the sociologists have analyzed this when they talk about charism, that you have the charismatic leader surrounded by his early, fervent, all excited disciple. As I said a little earlier, it's a little...
Why would Blant put so much emphasis on these disciplines?
Because of the
And
spirituality of the time. We've seen that over and over and over again.
But I mean, even with people who were novices or just joining the group, they would all be using.
Well, sure. That doesn't strike us older ones as quite so strange, huh? Because although we didn't get very much into this business of corporal penance and all that, there was a fair amount of it. We were told, for example, that our director of novices wore a hair shirt sometimes, and he would describe to us these instruments of penance, and it was all part of spirituality and identifying with Jesus crucified and all that. And so, first of all, we were often humiliated for the least little thing, and that was part of the trial and the test. And you were encouraged. Now, we didn't get too much into the things they were doing in the 17th century. After all, we were in the 20th century. But there was a sort of a taste for this, and among some of the novices, they began to do crazy things like that. We had a couple in our group. We used to call them scoops. But they put pebbles in their shoes and, you know, all sorts of little things, or sleep without the pillow, you know, or penance, you have to take your meals on your knees. Most of us managed to get that penance on, if you could, you tried to get it on Friday, which was a fast day, because you could eat more underneath the table. Nobody knew what you were doing. But, so it didn't strike us as so strange. So this is part of the spirituality time. All the spiritual writers were writing this. You have to wonder about the psychological dimension of it, though, don't you? You know, might have been a way of getting the jollies after all. You know, somebody said you can beat animals and you can beat a rug, but you can't beat sex, you know, so you have to find some sort of a substitute for it, I suppose. And so this may have been, that's perhaps a judgment. But you do have to wonder a little bit about because when you get carried away.
I was struck by the food. They talk about the delicate constitution of LaSalle. Did Blaine really exaggerate that, you think? Or was that something about special?
Yeah, well, Gus made the point that he was delicately brought up, but he was brought up in a relatively wealthy bourgeois home where they would be served the finest foods, huh? They would have what I suppose today we'd call gourmet cooking, served in a series of several courses and very delicately and all that. And nothing, where these characters, they're eating oxtails and I suspect dogs and cats and rabbits and everything else, if there was meat at all, huh? And then for vegetables, it was like during the war in Washington where the econom would go up to the market and buy all the stuff that everybody else had thrown out, the kale and all that. And then we'd have to pick out the good pieces doing manual labor in the morning that would serve us the meal at noontime. So, you know, but so that, and of course the soup, you could be sure, was greasy, huh? They'd use old cuts of pork and everything else, and to get that stuff down after that type of a diet for the first 30 years of your life, sure it would have been different.
One thing that bothers me that you have referred to is our founder is a great saint because there was a near perfect matching between his behavior, his attitude, and the French school. And since that was so, he became a canonized saint. Therefore, if I'm to imitate the founder, I should find some new spiritual trend today, like, let us say, liberation, and I should latch on to the tenets and the canons of liberation theology, and if, in my case, there's a near matching between that, like our founder, people will think I'm great.
Yeah, the only trouble with that is you're in the wrong continent. If you want to develop a spirituality out of liberation theology, you have to be in South America, not North America. See, that's a very important point. Liberation theology it's a theology, but it is a spirituality that operates really only in countries where there's a need for liberation, such as there is in Latin America, such as does not exist. That's why we've heard people talk about we ought to have a theology and a spirituality of affluence in North America. No, but I mean, you're basically right. No, but we have to relate to God. Huh? We have to relate to God, and we have to develop a spirituality in the context of a relatively affluent society. And that's part of the problem, huh? Because the society is not only affluent, but it's highly secularized. And we have to somehow be part of that. We can't help but be part of it. And there's a tremendous optimism in our society about the body, for example. This business we were talking about last night of praying, of making mental prayer in front of a mirror, stark naked, you know. Well, then maybe that's the way, that's an adaptation to a mentality that exists in our society of healthy respect for the body and thanking God for it. So of course you're right. So it's getting a little late in the day for you and me and Gus and so on to find the right spirituality to it, because we're gonna be saints pretty soon. So if you haven't found it by now, you'd better hurry up. Where were we? Anything else on? Yes.
One quick question. On line page 20 in the book, too, he says it was called the Christian and Gratuitous Schools. Brothers of the Christian and Gratuitous Schools. When did that word Gratuitous Schools drop out in the title?
I guess at this assembly, because from then on they are the Brothers of the Christian Schools, as far as we know. Huh? But the title of the society keeps getting shifted around a good bit as time goes on. Gus, you look like you want to say something. No? I talked about little Blam pulls the Martha and Mary thing about De La Salle. De La Salle reluctantly, now this of course is something I find difficult, that all he wanted to do was be making meditation, and anything else for him was a distraction. Reminds me of when we arrived in Rome for the general chapter of 1966. For the Nice, we started the chapter with a retreat. And Nice told us all, well now, he says, we will all be genuinely religious for the first time since last year when you were on retreat. We will no longer have the distractions of the apostolic work. He didn't say apostolic work, of our ordinary routine life. But now we are truly going to be religious for the first time. And we went into 4 days of a monastic routine. And that was the mentality that prevailed. And even the word work, that no, it was important to be religious. And this was not De La Salle's attitude. If all you got to do is read this stuff to realize how busy he was and how much attention he had to pay to the brothers, to contracts, to deals with pastors, and so on and so forth, all of those long travels and so on. And yet he was able to maintain through all that a fantastic sense of the presence of God and to be able to pray at great length and enter into these spiritual practices and so on and so forth. But it was not a question of Martha and Mary. And, well, there's a lot of things to be said about the exegesis of Martha and Mary. Notice on page 42, something that illustrates very well what I was saying about the Sulpician school of spirituality, right just about plunk in the middle of the page. All he read in the gospel in the life of the Lord of the universe were examples of submission and dependence. Okay. There is not one of his, capital H, that is Christ. There is not one of Christ's mysteries, that is simply an event in the life of Christ, because it's part of the mystery of the incarnation, that does not afford us some instance of a particular kind of obedience. Notice the kenosis, the spirituality of subject to the laws of nature. He remained for 9 months in his mother's womb without trying to hasten the moment of his birth. There's little fetus Jesus, huh? in his mother's womb, anxious to get going and get on his life's work and so on, but he's patient enough to wait for 9 months until it's time for him to pop out. But that's a perfect example of identifying with a mystery in the life of Christ, according to the spirituality. And a good bit of the devotion to Mary centers around that notion that Jesus was there in her womb, waiting and relating to her and everything else and so on during all that time. page 46. I don't have the French, but it'd be interesting to see when it's a question of the top of the page. Whatever was most lowly, most demeaning, most distasteful in the household chores was what he preferred. He managed to choose those tasks or having them assigned to him: sweeping, washing dishes, carrying out the garbage, cleaning the restrooms. Well, the restrooms, of course, were outdoor toilets, needless to say. There was no indoor plumbing. And here he puts it as a typical thing that the founder did. But then later on, he relates the story of Bartholomew when the founder thought he had permission to go and clean the outhouse to get some straw and so on. And Bartholomew said, "Hey, no, I wouldn't let you do that." So there's another one of those examples of contradiction. But, the word restroom is certainly glossing over a very ugly reality, as you know if you've ever been in an outdoor camp where that's the only facility available. He has an interesting exegesis on the rule about in recreation not to talk about anybody who's living, that he had to modify it except to speak well of them. What about lapping up the soup on the floor? Yes.
What about all these worms in the soup and stuff like that?
Yeah, what about
How
that?
little did we take this?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if that happened from time to time. Used to happen to us once in a while too. You know, the old thing, well, that's one way of getting protein, or there's a worm in my soup, don't worry, it won't eat much. So, then the whole business of Henri Leroux, and picking off Henri Leroux, sending him off to study, and so on and so forth. And of course, he follows the story all the way to the end, even though this doesn't happen until later on in Paris. And then the tremendous emotion that he shows on page 53. Naturally, John, so here he introduces Henri Leroux, says the founder wanted to make him a priest, and then he kills him off on the next page already. The end of that next to last paragraph. Prudent, wise, endowed with good judgment and sufficient learning, filled with zeal, the spirit of a state, he was entirely capable of causing the Holy Founder, who loved him so much, to live again in his person. De La Salle loved him and honored him and entertained the fondest hopes. Naturally, he could not be sensible. But down below, the saddest events seem unable to penetrate. But on this occasion, his emotions and his grief clearly appeared. Only for a quarter of an hour at most, however. After this brief space of time, he recovered his usual attitude of peace, thanks to his entire submission to God's will and abandonment. So he really felt this pretty badly, the death of Henri Leroux. But it's premature to introduce it at this point. He wouldn't give anybody his blessing. The whole business of women in spiritual direction. The business of the now he starts a big campaign against the schools and the schoolmasters here because they're punishing the students. I am very inclined to think this did not happen in Reims. Again, that may have been part of the campaign against him in Paris when the Compagnon here is trying to get after him and so on. But it seems very unlikely, this extended discussion of the using excessive corporal punishment to these rowdy kids who deserved every bit of it and so on and so forth. Right? Then we have the foundation of the School for Country Schoolmasters, and then the foundation of a juniorate for the juniors, so that by the time he's finished here in the Rue Neuve, he's got this group of ecclesiastics with a sort of a seminary operating there. He's got the community brothers who are teaching. He's got this school operating for country schoolmasters, and he's got a group of juniors being all prepared. And of course, again, De La Salle, Blanc can't help carrying the story of the juniors all the way to Paris, where he'll tell it again when we get to that. So he was not one to give the answer, we'll get to that. He puts all these things in right away.
Right away.
Right away. Then you can say we already had it by the time you get to it, because it spoils the sequence. So that's all that I want to highlight with this. Is there anything more now before we leave the founder and Reims? I'm kind of rushing over some important things at the end there, but I presume you've read it and understand the significance.
Am I bothering you?
Go ahead. Well, I'm glad you added the too much. The answer to the first is yes, and the second, no.
I'm moving back just a bit, but it's a very general question, you see. This is in the first thing, page 88, and I quote, De La Salle, however, did not like to rush into things and did not wish to do anything without the advice of his ordinary director of conscience. Now, from that, I conclude he had a hierarchy of 3 directors of conscience: his ordinary, his extraordinary, and his crisis director of conscience. Now, am I reading too much into that?
Yes,
Huh?
I think so. I think what that means, yes and no is the answer. As we saw, I think he always had one spiritual director that was considered his regular director. It was probably Tronçon in Paris, then it became Roland until Roland died, then it became Jacques Collot as long as it was in Reims. But as we saw, if he didn't like what the director was saying or was convinced God wanted something else, he had no hesitancy about going to somebody else, to Barré, for example, or to somebody else that he thought could give him some advice. So I think Blain's referring to, but I don't think he hierarchized them that way. I mean, that's Blain's expression. But he's referring to the ordinary one, probably Calou. Okay.
Just on that, Bland seems to accept that, or he seems to say that at the time the people would know who your spiritual director was, so that if you made a decision, people would blame your spiritual director
Yes.
as much as yourself.
Yeah, and again, that's probably autobiographical on his part, too, huh? Blain may have felt a little bit of criticism for some of the things he was directing people to do. It's quite possible. Whenever he gets in it, because it's another one of those instances where he goes on for about 2 pages trying to defend the spirit, the reputation. He feels spiritual directors have a bad reputation, and he feels that something ought to be said to redress the balance. How applicable it would have been in the historical situation, suppose. Okay, we ready to go to Paris?
All set.
Yes.
In reference to the bottom of page 53 about the 15 minutes, etc., is that a connection with Ignatius Loyola, where he either says or wrote or reported or said that all he would require was 15 minutes of meditation to calm his submission, etc., to God's rule, even if he lost the Jesuits?
Quite possibly. At least I think we can say that was part of the spirituality of the time. That the founder often makes reference in his own writings to go to your room for a quarter of an hour, or to think this over for a quarter. It recurs several times in the founder's writings that I can think of. It may well have been a practice at Saint-Sulpice also, for them to, or that would be part of a penance, go to the chapel for a quarter of an hour, things like that. So I think that's, again, typical 17th century. It's whether he actually spent 15 minutes or not. You know, again, it's one of Blain's things that he's pulling out of. That he took him a little time to get used to the idea. Actually, it might have been a day or two, if the truth were told. Okay. Now, what should we highlight here with regard to this in the little time where notice we're getting a little bit back on schedule, not completely. We are if we finish this, but it depends on what you want to bring out here and what I think I would like to highlight. First of all are the basic lines of the story, just to get settled in Paris and the Rue Princesse. Now, this map that I just passed out, get your bearings a little bit there. Can you follow the stuff on the map?
Yes.
Where is my folder? I know I've got one here someplace. There it is. Actually, this was put together. I adapted this from a map that was published in a little Pilgrim's Guide to Paris that was produced by the French brothers for the 300th anniversary of the founder's birth in 1951, and it was reprinted afterwards for the tercentenary. So you can see all the places there. We're looking north. If you, and number 15 is where the present Rue de Sèvres is, which is facing south. And if you go out the door of Rue de Sèvres and turn left, which would mean you're going right on this map, then you wind up in this central section of the left bank. And number 1 right there in the middle, that's where Saint-Sulpice is. Number 3 right up above it in the parish that's where the school on the Rue Princesse was. And that building still stands today. It's the only building in France, it's the only building in Paris that's still standing. The General Hospice in Rouen is still there too, but it's the only building in Paris where the building is there. But we know the sites of all the other schools. So all of those places where the founder gets in trouble. For example, notice the Rue de Bac, you can see the identification there, but the school is up there, number 4, as Blanc says, very close to the Pont Royal. There's the bridge across the Seine that goes right across there. That's across to the Rue Saint-Honoré, where the founder wound up, one of his residences, and that he was on his way there one day when he fell badly. We'll see a little bit about that story a little later. If you go back to number 1, Saint-Sulpice, if you go straight across to the right, you'll see number 2, and that's where the Sorbonne was. So you can see that when the founder was studying at Saint-Sulpice, the walk to the Sorbonne was not very far. I think that's all we did. In Vaugirard, which is our work for tomorrow, if you can see that's way over on the left. It's to the west of the main part of town. It was a faubourg at the time, as we would say, a suburb, but it's now incorporated into part of the city of Paris. But you see, it wasn't so terribly far. It's kind of a straight line. That Rue de Vaugirard, by the way, the Rue runs all the way straight through, right past Saint-Sulpice. So it's a straight route to go, and it's not terribly far. Okay, so keep this with you because, and refer to it as you're reading. If you try to locate the places that being spoken about, it'll help make it a little more vivid and real for you.
Is number 10 still there? That's the one at the Bastille.
Oh, the Bastille is not there any longer, but this great big column where the Bastille was, but that, I put that, indicated, or they indicated that there too, I think, because, so you can see how it was relatively close to number 11.
There's one just beside the Bastille at the moment.
What?
School, the publishing.
Yes, I was just going to, I'm glad you reminded me of that because when you asked the question, it reminded me to say something. You see where number 10 is, everybody up here at this, that's the suburb known as Saint-Antoine. And so you have the Boulevard du Faubourg Saint-Antoine, and coming off that circle where the Bastille was, there's a Rue Saint-Antoine, and we have a school there. Although I understand now we no longer have any brothers teaching in it, but we still have a community. And that's where Léon Arose holds up when he's in Paris. Okay? And of course, right, just off from the Bastille is the school. It's the school known as the School of the Franc Bourgeois, because these were, and we set up a school there because the Franc Bourgeois were the bourgeois who didn't have to pay school tax. And next to that is the Church of St. Paul, which was the pastor that received the founder when he had to give up the Grand Maison. And right across, if you see number 10 and go down that street a little bit, and then we're to go up a next street, which isn't on the map, that's where the Place Royale was, and that's where Barré was living in Paris. And that was where the founder would have gone. So the founder knew that area very, very well. Okay, so the history of this, Barré had left Rouen for Paris, and he still had the idea. He was delighted when he heard what was happening in Reims with De La Salle, with the schools for gratuitous schools for poor boys, that he had a stable community, and so, of course, Barré was trying to tell the founder. He was the one who advised him to give up his canonry, to trust Providence and everything else. And very pleased with everything that was happening, Barré is encouraging the founder to come to Paris. By this time, the pastor of the parish is de la Barmondière, who was one of the spiritual directors when the founder was in the seminary. We are now, in 1688, the founder was there 16 years earlier than that, 17 years earlier. So his former teacher or former director or former faculty member anyway is now the pastor, a very spiritual man apparently, but a very much of an ultramontane. He's the one who said that if anybody voted for those Gallican articles that the king was imposing, that he'd commit a mortal sin. And he's the one who wrote his doctoral dissertation and defended the thesis that the Pope is personally infallible. But he was a good man, and he wanted De La Salle to come, and all of that business that we read in the previous book about everybody was pushing De La Salle to come. He had made a promise to De La Barmondiere, apparently, to send brothers. Barré wanted him to come and so on. But Jacques Callot said, no, stay here. You've got to get the thing more solidly founded in Reims first. So there was pressure from them, and the pressure of a promise, apparently. Now, his own Archbishop Letellier offers then to take over the whole operation of the schools, to provide all the money they needed, to give them stability and so on, if he would limit his operation to the city of Reims. And I think that's where, for the first time, he kind of begins to see that, especially with the pressure from Barré, that no, it's more important to go to Paris. It's the capital after all. Blain says, prematurely again, that this was the route to Rome to get permission to take the vows and to get the vows and turn into an order. So, well, he's not thinking that way at all. I think Blain misses completely the originality of what it was the founder was organizing. So this thing of Letellier, and again, it would be basing the schools not on Providence, but on one particular archbishop. And De La Salle was experienced enough in the ways of ecclesiastics to know that that whole thing could collapse the minute we got a new bishop, as happens very often even to us still today. So that was another motive that he had for getting there. The negotiations, however, take over a long time. They go over a long period. It's a little difficult to trust Blain completely on this, especially with regard to the role of his own brother, who was in the seminary at the time, Jean-Louis. If you look at page 70, the bottom of that top paragraph. Now, the whole thing here is apparent. I never have been able to understand this completely. Maybe Gus has an insight into it. But why was the founder so reluctant to go to Paris until he actually got the word from the horse's mouth, so to speak, from the pastor? So De La Salle wished to receive a positive word from the parish priest himself. Parish priest, of course, is the word for pastor. They don't use that expression in England, in Europe.
Who is that?
Huh?
Who's the pastor?
De la Barmondiere. To obtain this, he replied that his younger brother Louis was about to set out for the seminary of Saint-Sulpice. He would make the arrangements and take all the measures needed to conclude them. Well, Jean-Louis entered the seminary in November of 1682. That's another interesting question. When the founder moved out of the family home and sold it and moved into the Rue Neuve, did his own brother go with him? Probably he did, because we know from the entry from the records in Saint-Sulpice that Jean-Louis de La Salle entered Saint-Sulpice in November 1682. So that would have been considerably before this. And he left, and he finished his courses at the Sorbonne in 1686. So Louis, it's wrong to say, was setting out for the seminary, and he would make the arrangements. So he was there in the early stages of this negotiation, but he could not have played a significant role as it was coming to a conclusion. Then Compagnon is so interested in getting somebody because he's only got one assistant there with him, and he's so anxious to get the brothers that he goes to Reims himself. De La Salle isn't there, and so it's Compagnon who takes all the initiative in the first place. And then Compagnon sends him word, maybe through Jean-Louis, maybe on his way back, that, oh, the coast is all clear. The founder won't come on that. After all, Compagnon he was a priest in charge of all of the schools in the parish. Remember, way back earlier, Blain tells us that the parish of Saint-Sulpice was as big as a diocese. And when you get to Buttimer too, I think Gerard Rummery will help to indicate something of the reputation of the pastors of the parish of Saint-Sulpice, how pastoral they were and how concerned for all the things of their parish, in spite of the troubles they gave De La Salle. Why the De La Salle wouldn't come without a direct word from from the pastor through Compagnon, who was a priest and in charge of the schools, to me is a little bit of a mystery. So then finally, when the reason becomes clear down there, de la Barmondière tells him, sends word through Baudrin, who was another one of his assistants at the time, that yes, he wants him to come. And then de La Salle is satisfied. So he goes to Paris with two brothers on the eve of the feast of St. Matthias. On page 70, Hernandez, those footnotes are from Hernandez, of course, the translator. He says apparently February 23rd. Actually, it's February 24th because 1688 was a leap year. And so in leap year, the Feast of Matthias is on the 25th, or used to be. Yeah?
Yeah, about that companion, why he didn't obey him right away or follow him. I kind of read that as an insight on the fact that this guy was a character, as he proved to be later on.
Yeah.
And he didn't trust him.
It's quite possible.
And I even
Yeah.
took his being absent that time when he came as an excuse not to have to deal with the character.
Yeah, that's a good insight. I had never thought of that. He might, the word might have gotten back to him either through his brother or the contacts he had in Saint-Sulpice that this guy is not dependable and you better not have much to do with him.
Yeah.
Because he certainly turns out to be one of the bad guys in this dramatic presentation. Right, so then we have the whole sad story of the situation once they get there anyway. Once they get there, from February to April, the pastor isn't even aware what's going on in the school. The founder is there with the two brothers. Compagnon is running the show. This other fellow is running the hosiery thing. The kids are coming and going at will. The place is utter chaos, a kind of a zoo. The founder's trying to do what he can, divide them into little classes and so on, but he has no real authority. He tells the brothers, just be patient, we'll see what happens. And then finally, the pastor comes on this visit and he sees what's going on and so on and so forth. So then he takes steps to get rid of, Compagnon and to put de La Salle in charge, with Compagnon still there. And he says, well, the next man will take charge of it, and the next man is Father Baudrin, who succeeds de la Barmondière as the pastor. And then de La Salle takes Baudrin as his spiritual director. So who was it that asked about the ecclesiastical authority? That's the answer to that, Chris, that he then becomes his permanent spiritual director, okay, replacing Calou, who was no longer available to him. So, and of course he knew Baudrin, he knew his reputation from Saint-Sulpice, because he was one of the major spiritual directors when the founder was in the seminary there. And so that Baudrin becomes his spiritual director. And he has the same problems with Baudrin, of course, as that he did. So Baudrin is both his ecclesiastical superior and is in charge of the parish and everything in it, huh? So in that sense, he's his ecclesiastical superior, if that's your question. Is it?
Well, yeah, so legally what that meant, do you know what that meant?
Pastor of the parish. Okay? Yeah, okay? That's all it really means. And this school was dependent on the pastor. And Boutet has that whole big thing about the importance of the pastor in relationship to schools and the importance of the deal that the founder made with the pastor when he began to open schools and so on. Okay?
The literature says that Compagnon's assistant was running a factory, and I'm quite confused, it doesn't matter too much, quite confused as to whether it was stockings or toques or linen or what. But it's supposed to have been a factory. Wow.
Well, a factory, of course, this is prior to the Industrial Revolution. All it would mean would be a room with all the tools they needed and the necessity things to, it wouldn't have been a factory in the sense of General Motors or something, with an assembly line or anything like that. But they were training these kids to be able to make, they were probably making stockings of various kinds. Probably had a big sale with the clergy that they wore under their robes instead of pants. But now, if you've all read this, I don't think it's necessary to go through all the stories. But three significant things occur here. Huh? First of all, it's interesting that there's again great drama, isn't there, between the whole business of Compagnon resenting the founder's influence, but the minute the founder is put in charge, he takes over. And it turns immediately into a first-class school with good discipline, locking the doors so they can't get in And maybe we should try that in some of our schools instead of having the vice principal or whoever does it giving out late passes and things like that, because then you wouldn't be able to collect the fines. But locking the doors so they couldn't get in, then locking them so they couldn't get out. And gambling apparently is he makes the point of that, and it seems to be some background for it, that these kids were gambling, and they had no garden, they just had a little courtyard, and when they weren't making stockings or paying attention to the inept school teacher, they'd be out gambling like crazy. Then Bland pushes another button, about what's in this terrible vice of gambling and the root of everything else. Well, I don't, again, compulsive gamblers can be a problem, but whether all those kids were is another question. Okay, so, but now Baudrin is so pleased with the success of this school that he decides now it's time to open another one in his parish on the Rue du Bac, which is, you see it there on the map of the school, is number 4. And now, this is a little bit out of the center of the parish, but it's still in the parish. All of that whole area was the parish of Saint-Sulpice. And so apparently the school was very close to where one of these schoolmasters, now Bland he says the whole corporation went after him, but apparently in this particular locality, the school was definitely intruding on the territory of one of the schoolmasters who had been assigned to that particular territory. And so this is the first instance of schoolmasters ganging up on the founder. Now I'd like to talk a little bit more about that at length, and to comment on the memoir and the habit, let's say a little bit more about that, and let's look a little more closely at the loss of these 2 brothers. And so we'll start with that tomorrow, the tail end of today's assignment. That shouldn't take very long, so by the time we get to tomorrow, we should be pretty much back onto the lectures will correspond a little more closely to the assigned readings. Okay?